Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. This is Matt Gayer, Co-Executive Director of the Catalog for Philanthropy. We're talking about important metrics for nonprofits today, what to track and how to track it. We're going to give everyone just another minute here to hop on, just one more minute, then we'll get started. Thank you. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. For those of y'all who just joined, my name is Matt Gayer, Co-Executive Director at the Catalog for Philanthropy. We'll be talking about important metrics for nonprofits today, what to track and how to track it. A couple things to note before we begin. You should be able to see our screen right now, hear our audio. If you have issues with either of those today, just let us know. We'll try to address those challenges as quickly as we can. If you have any questions throughout the day, feel free to ask those anytime. We'll answer those questions as they come up or at the end of the webinar today. We will be sending out a copy of the slides and recording shortly afterwards. So we will receive a copy of the slides and recording shortly after the webinar today, along with a very short evaluation, less than a minute long. We really appreciate you taking the time to fill it out. So that we'll go ahead and dive on in. I will say for this, when we're talking about metrics and data, there's so much we could track that we obviously won't be able to cover everything today. We'll focus a little bit on, we had some questions prior to the webinar submitted around fundraising data and development data, what's most important to track there, communications data, as well as programmatic data. So those are going to be the three areas we start with today, but I'll be sure to leave some time at the end that if you have questions about other elements, other organizational track, right, around HR, finance, any other aspect of the organization, some of the tech utilization, happy to talk about some of that data additionally. A couple of things for context before we get into some specific tips today. The biggest question, right, is always when it comes to data, why? A lot of us, most of us, the vast majority, probably do not have someone whose job at the organization is purely data, right? Every now and then you run into a nonprofit, medium or large size that maybe does, but for the most of us, this is an added part or a planned part of a job that already has a lot of other things to do. So how are we kind of making time for this? Why are we making time for this? And there's three big things we see folks should or could be using for their data, because if we're going to take the time to do this right, we want to make sure we're getting all the impact out of it we can. So one thing obviously is that it can help make us more efficient internally, right? We can figure out what's working, what's not, where do I want to invest resources to try to get something to start working, where I want to double down on something that's already going well. What can data tell me about investments I might need to be making in my programming, in my staffing, in my communication efforts, all of that stuff that we can learn from this. And that's going to make us more efficient and better at planning, and especially while the outside world, right, remains with a heightened level of uncertainty in a lot of realms. It's helpful for us to internally have a lot of clarity on what's happening. The more we have that, the easier that planning and strategy work is going to be. Secondly, a lot of times data, especially for an organization that's been around for a while, is going to help us challenge the status quo internally or externally. So thinking about how can we use data to either internally change some bias we might have on staff or even with ourselves or board about what is and isn't going well with the organization, or what is and isn't impactful about our work. And also can be helpful to change the status quo in terms of what some of our donor community beliefs might be about either the community or folks we work alongside or the work we do ourselves. And then finally, engaging stakeholders. Data a lot of times is something that can engage folks. When we do conversations with donors, right, and people that are giving, people that are volunteering, we see often those folks that engage at a really high level usually are emotionally motivated, right? They're rarely motivated just simply by a stat. But for a lot of folks, they're intrigued to the organization. The reason they first gave that $50 gift, right, that $20 gift, is often because they saw a stat, right? They saw a piece of data, they heard what you were doing kind of numerically, right, or in some type of quantitative form, and that actually motivated them to make that initial gift before the emotional connection elevated them to give their time or money at a higher level. So we know it's an important gateway for folks, and we want to make sure we prioritize that. So with that context, right, and how we're kind of using data, both internally or external, we'll go ahead and dive on it. The rest of this presentation will focus on some specific metrics, but we just wanted to say this at the outset, that a lot of times when we say data, naturally, people's heads go straight to numbers and stats, right? And that is definitely a big part of it, and we'll talk about that quite a bit today. But I just want to do a little plug and a little reminder that qualitative data is just as important, right? And that's data we're getting in a more narrative format, right? So this could be the open response on a survey question. It could be looking for trends across individual interviews or clients that we serve. It could be taking oral histories from some of our longer-term volunteers or staff, right, or board members. All that type of information can actually be incredibly powerful as well. So, thinking about how are we'll talk largely about quantitative data today because I know it's where many people's questions lie. Just encouraging you to also think about how are we collecting that qualitative data? How are we using that to round out what we know about the organization? And a lot of that sometimes is going to be more contextual, right? So we're going to be able to get a lot of outcomes or outputs or scope and kind of input data. We're looking at the quantitative side, but the qualitative can really tell us how that work is getting done, right? How people are relating to it, how they're thinking and feeling about it. But as I said, kind of diving into the more specific data recommendations today, and again, happy to cover additional data as well or questions that people have on this because there's so much we could cover. We're going to start though with fundraising data where we get a lot of questions and specifically right now for organizations, really critical to be thinking about. When we think about the trends presentation we just did last week on what we expect for 2023 in fundraising, we know a lot of things are changing, right? Major donors are more critical than ever before. So it's really critical that we are tracking and learning and kind of staying on top of that audience as much as possible. But we also know that grassroots donors are leaving and harder to get engaged. So also really important that for our mass kind of donor data or even our prospect data, that we're really staying on top of trends that we're seeing, who is, who isn't giving, who's leaving, where are new people coming from. All these questions have never been more important as we're seeing this kind of complicated two different trends, two different kind of headwinds in the individual donor space. So a couple of things we're going to look at fundraising data-wise. The first is exactly based off what we're just saying about those trends, which is who's still giving, right? When I think about who's giving to the organization right now, where's that kind of money coming from? Where are those donors coming from? And a big thing we want to look at there is retention. So we know overall the national nonprofit donor retention rate is about 47%. So over half the people that gave to a nonprofit last year will not give to that same nonprofit this year based on data, right? Now, small nonprofits typically do better than this because we know our donors better, but it's really important that if you were to ask me what is the one piece of development data I should know for my organization, beyond obviously how much we raise from how many people, et cetera, is really this retention rate, right? What's my donor loyalty, my donor engagement, right? How many of my donors are coming back from last year, giving again this year? Because that's going to give me a really good sense of planning, right? So if I raised, $100,000 from individual donors last year, but I know my retention rate is only about 60% each year, who can I expect back, right? How can I start forecasting how much I'm going to be raised this year from that? Does that retention rate change at different giving levels, right? So maybe we have lower retention of lower level donors, but higher retention of higher level, which is often what we see. But really looking at the data to know that. So a couple of things when it comes to retention data within fundraising. This is a stat that we're usually updating annually. So this is a good time to do it, right? So last calendar year just ended. You can also do this in the fiscal year. If you have a fiscal year, it's non-calendar based, but it's pretty easy to do in the calendar year as well. We want to look at kind of who gave both last year and the year before, right? So what was our donor retention rate for 2022? That's going to include anyone that gave in 2021 as well as 2022. We should have complete data for both of those, so relatively easy to calculate. And then we obviously can dive deeper, right? So that overall number is helpful. It's helpful to give us some context. It's going to be helpful to look at year over year as well. So again, a lot of the benchmarks you're going to see around this, you probably are naturally performing better than. So it's going to be helpful to kind of compare to ourselves, right? To see, are we doing this better each year? If my retention rate right now is 75%, which would be amazing, let's go for 77 next year, right? So trying to set goals that push us farther, even if we're already doing really well at it. But we can also dive deeper, right? So looking at that overall retention rate is helpful, but breaking it down farther. So a big one that we recommend looking at is retention rate of first-time donors. So who gave you a gift in 2021 that had never donated before, and how many of those people gave again in 2022? Because that's what's going to really tell me that for folks that are coming to our organization, how am I doing at engaging them, at convincing them that this is an important thing for them to be a part of, something that they care about. And we see that once you get a donor to give for 2 to 3 years in a row initially, they usually keep giving for a pretty long time, right? Unless some type of life event changes, right, or a big community event changes. But generally speaking, if you get 2 or 3, people are creatures of habit, right? They get in that habit, they get used to it, they see themselves as a donor to their organization, and kind of just keep going, often increasing their gift over time. But if we don't keep them for that first year after they gave, it's really hard to get them back, right? They gave in 21, now in 22. That's going to be a challenging donor to get back in 23. They fall in that lapsed category, which we definitely can go to, and we should go to with ask, but it becomes more difficult, right? We could also look at retention rate by giving level, by number of years, right? So how many of my donors that have been giving to me for 5 years continue to do so in 2022? So anything we're breaking it down by, that can be a helpful one. Looking at my pre-pandemic donor retention rate, so donors that were giving to me at least in 2019 and have consecutively, how many of those folks gave again in 2022? That's letting me know I'm keeping those long-term supporters. Separately looking at the pandemic donor base, what my retention rate is there. All that's going to tell us something, and it's going to tell us things that we can use to kind of better target our donor communications and donor events this year. On the lapsed donor part, the only thing I will say is that in addition to kind of being able to create the list by doing this research, which is a benefit, also keeping track of when you reach out to them, how many folks are coming back, right? So you can set realistic goals for your lapsed donor outreach. Usually the response rate is low, but also if we don't reach back out, we're going to get probably none of them. So it's better than nothing. So that's going to be a good thing to track so that we can set realistic goals. And all of this to help us budget better, forecast better, so we have a better sense of our likely revenue for the year. The other piece of fundraising data, the other pieces of fundraising data, I should say, we wanted to look at quickly, is really kind of collective across the program. So obviously, there's a lot of data we're tracking in fundraising about individual donors, and for individual stewardship, especially of major donors, critically important. We chose not to spend a lot of our time today talking about that, but if you have questions about key elements of kind of prospect research to track, key elements of kind of an individual donor's journey, happy to talk about that at the end. But most importantly, we're taking some time to look at some collective stats, right? So how's the health of our fundraising program? Not just did we raise our goal, but how did we raise our goal, and is that sustainable? So the first thing looking at there is average gift. So this can be a stat that really helps us understand, especially over time, how is our donor program growing, right? And this is something that we can look at, even if we've never done this analysis before, can look at historically, right? So I could go back to my 2019 giving, my 2018 giving, my 2020 giving, and see what was that average donation, right? And then look at it for this year, right? And is that going up or down, right? Generally speaking, as that's going up, especially if we're also looking at the number of donors, that can tell us, are people giving more to us over time, which is at least one indicator of donor engagement. It's not the indicator, but one indicator of donor engagement, which can be helpful. It can also be helpful to look at the average gift in other areas. So average gift, people have given for more than 5 years to see how well we're converting them to middle level or major level donors. Average major donor gift rate. So for those donors that gave above 1,000, how much did they give on average? Another great thing to look at in terms of their engagement rate is that number going up. And then the other one I would say for average gift, again, back to those first time donors, so critical to think about because donor acquisition is so difficult these days. What's the average gift people are giving when they make their first donation, right? So for donors that gave in 2022 that have never given to you before, what was that average amount? Comparing that to the years before, right? And getting a sense, is that going up or down? And that can tell you a little bit about both just kind of the health of the donor environment, but also how engaged folks are, excited they are when they find you, right? So if our average gift goes up from 25 to 50 bucks, either we're reaching out to a new audience, which can be helpful for us to realize, or it's the same audience, but the folks that are coming are buying into the message more right away. And either way, helpful information for us to learn, and we can then kind of go farther down that to figure out how we can continue to grow that over time. Secondly, thinking about new donors, just looking at how many new donors did we get last year, right? How many people gave for the first time during the year? At what level were they giving, like we were just talking about? What time did they give during the year? Because that's also going to help us probably figure out what source. So especially if it's a small enough number, we might even want to do some individual kind of research and kind of trying to figure out kind of how do they find us, right? Do they come to us at Giving Tuesday? Do they come to us during our peer-to-peer campaign? They attended a fundraising event. They saw us through an external publication. Like if you're in DC, you're a partner of the catalog. That's how they found you. Finding out kind of what source, where they come from, because that's going to help direct our marketing efforts moving forward. Again, with acquisition being really tough right now in the space, getting new donors being a real challenge, this can be really important to help direct our limited time and efforts into the things that are going to be most fruitful for us, for our organization. The third thing here, timing. So again, a lot of what we're talking about here is really going to help us forecast more accurately what we expect to happen this year, right? If we only got a handful of new donors last year and we plan to basically run back the same marketing and communications techniques, right, and fundraising techniques, we're probably going to expect to get a handful of new donors. We shouldn't forecast massive growth in that space. If on the other hand, we did great with new donors last year, we might lean into that, right, and forecast a little bit more growth. In addition to that, timing is going to be helpful for us to really look at data about when are donations coming in. We should also be doing this on the foundation or kind of institutional front. This is going to help us when we're thinking about financial things like cash flow, really understanding, when can we expect revenue in the door? Is it all coming in December, right? What percentages of our giving is just end of year giving? When's that institutional funding coming in that's maybe a little less episodic? And again, looking at that timeline, because we know cash flow for nonprofits can be so irregular, they're really getting that strong revenue picture is going to help with our stewardship and cultivation efforts, right? If I know, okay, these 5 donors typically give in July, so I want to make sure I'm talking to them in April or May, right? In addition to that, it's also going to help us with that cash flow, so it's an important data point to track. And then finally, looking at major gifts. So especially because major gifts are such a big part of the giving landscape right now, because they've grown so much lately, we really want to make sure we're tracking some data around this, even if we only have a handful of donors now, so we get in the habit of tracking it as hopefully that program grows in the future for us. So looking at kind of what's our major gift floor, right? So how much do you give before you're a major donor? Again, why that's important is typically if you're designated as a major donor for the organization, you're going to get some one-on-one attention from the executive director, board members, development staff, right? And we only have the capacity to do that so much. So it very well may be something we see this happen in organizations all the time, that we track that number of major donors and realize, hey, we've gotten to a point that we either need to expand who's supporting these donors, or we got to raise the floor of what we consider a major donor, so we can really target those kind of driving our giving program with the individual support that they're going to require. What's our biggest gift overall? This can be a helpful stat to look at for fundraising because it really tells us top level, are we bringing in more people and more resources over time? Are the folks that are giving in a meaningful way continuing to be more engaged and giving at a higher level moving forward? And as we all know, with things like inflation and increased costs, our giving is going to have to increase as well. So we've been sitting on the same kind of top level gift of $5,000, $10,000 for a decade. That means something different than it did 10 years ago. So we're going to need to look to kind of continue to grow that. And then finally, just the number of major donors, right? Are we growing who is in that category overall? And kind of looking a little bit about how they got there so we can hopefully direct some other people along the way. Again, happy to answer questions about that, but we're going to go ahead and move to communications data as well, so we have time to touch on programmatic data before pausing for questions. So for communications engagement, kind of looking at what people are responding to is our big goal here, right? So on emails, obviously a lot of data we could be tracking. I will say most of this is if you're using an email manager in some way, right? So wanting to send those not just from our Gmail, but something else that we can track that a little better with. And the benefit of that, one of the many benefits of that, is that we do get quite a bit of data from it. So some of the big things we're going to look at, that open rate on our emails, and that's usually the first thing we're looking at. The most important thing is that are people opening emails we send? Doesn't mean they read it, doesn't mean they do anything with it, but at least they're opening it, they're probably glancing at it. And a lot of our donor communications, if it's not kind of solicitation giving season, our real goal of it is to kind of stay top of mind for them. We may want them to engage, learn more, do something, but at minimum, we want those donor emails or broader communication emails to volunteers, etc., to help people keep us top of mind. There's so much going on in their lives and in the world. It's a hard task for us to kind of stay top of mind. So the more we can do that, better. And open rate's really telling us that. Again, there's plenty of benchmarks to look at out there. It depends on if it's a regular newsletter or one-off email, etc. But really, looking at your own data and comparing it over time is going to be most helpful. So feel free to Google some benchmarks, right? Look at what people are saying. But a lot of times when they're sharing nonprofit benchmarks, again, that's including things like Red Cross, big national, international NGOs, and that may or may not be helpful for you when actually comparing to. So more importantly, I would say looking at your average open rate of your email newsletter last year and comparing it to this year, right? Are we getting better over time? And that's really our goal, right? However we're doing now, improving at least a little bit moving forward, whether that's really well or relatively poorly right now. So looking at open rate, going to tell us about interest. Looking at click-through rate, I will say for this one, not that it's a specific benchmark, but just know that this is usually a very small number. So do not be feeling negative about your email program because it is. But if you're able to get that click-through rate, and that's the rate of people who open your email and then click a link in it, right, to go do something. That's going to be really helpful because we can look at that over time and then compare it to the content and see when we're sharing stuff, what are people clicking on? Are they clicking on the article to learn more? Are they clicking on the volunteer opportunities? Are they clicking on the chance to donate? Are they clicking on just a link back to our website or our socials? That's going to help us then craft content that we think our audience wants over time. So that click-through rate can be really telling in terms of what content's working and not. The open rate is going to be most impacted by who's sending it, when you're sending it, and the subject. The click-through rate is going to be most impacted by the style and the content of the email. So those are the other things you can learn for those two pieces. Unsubscribe data, that can be helpful. So, looking at how many people unsubscribe when we send an email. If that spikes for some reason, that can tell us one or two things. Sometimes, although this is rare, it's something about the content of the email. People that like most of the time when people unsubscribe, it's because of a frequency or a timing, right? We sent it on a Sunday. They don't like to think about work community stuff on Sundays, and because they have the time, they unsubscribe. Or we've sent 4 emails this month. It's too many. We were too top of mind, and therefore they want to unsubscribe. So the timing of it, whether that be specific or cumulative, is usually what drives the unsubscribing. So that can be a good thing for us to look at and learn from. Overall list size, right? Am I bringing more people in to look at my communications over time? That's critical, right? We're growing that audience over time. So that's the other thing we're looking at there. And then finally, if we do have a CRM, a donor database that speaks to our email manager, we can start doing a little bit of comparison of email behavior and donor behavior, right? So, what percentage of my newsletter emails I sent are typically opened by someone who did give money last year compared to someone who didn't? It might help us then start doing some predictive data there with, okay, if someone opens, 6 out of 10 of the monthly newsletters during the year, I feel pretty confident they're going to give during the end of year campaign. Again, not something we know for sure, but something that can, like we were talking about earlier with fundraising data, help us forecast a little bit, how many people are going to be giving and at what level. Looking at social media, again, a lot more data that we could talk about than this, but just a couple of things quickly. Audience size collectively by platform. This can be really helpful. And something also helpful to look at some of your peer organizations and what their audience size is, just to kind of both track your own growth, but also are other people engaging more or less on social than you are. Engagement stats, every platform is going to be different, and every organization is going to focus on something a little different. But whether it's comments, shares, or likes, just look at the same stat over time, seeing how that engagement changes, because both for engagement and audience, I'm hoping that goes up over time with my content. And most importantly, is really looking at the type of content that got the most engagement. So looking at my top 10, most engaged with posts over the last 6 months, and is there a trend there in that content that I then can tap into, use more, and get more engagement moving forward with. And then finally, event attendance, who's coming, where they're coming from, right, is going to be helpful for us. The final category we'll talk about, then I'll pause for questions, is programmatic data, scope, impact, and milestones. So obviously, the organizations we work with, all of y'all online, do a lot of different work, so we don't have kind of specific issue-based metrics here, although happy to talk about those on a one-off basis. But for scope, this is data about the size of your program, right? We serve 300 kids, we serve 5,000 people across the region, whatever it might be. This also is where we often include demographic data. Or location or place-based data. So thinking about who's participating and how many people are participating. This is going to be helpful to give context to your work, right? If I say, 97% of our clients have gainful employment within 12 months of participating in our program, that's going to mean something very different if I have 10 clients or 500 clients. For a lot of our organizations, because they're smaller organizations, that scope number may not be the really impressive piece, the impact is, but the scope is still going to be important to share. We just may want to share context on why, right? So we may only be working with 20 people, but the way we're doing it is incredibly time intensive. But we still want to share that context, that scope, that's going to help people wrap their heads around kind of what our program looks like. But because of that, it shouldn't be the only data to share. Impact data, we're thinking about the difference the program is making, right? Thinking about outputs and outcomes here. We really want to make sure it's clear what the impact means. We want to make sure we're taking any jargon out of that impact. We want to look at growth over time, so not just communicating how we're doing now, but how that's grown since we started doing it. And thinking about short and long term, right? So, a short-term stat might be that we improved, reading levels of the students that we tutor by X amount. A longer-term stat, medium-term stat is going to be high school graduation rates, possibly, right? The farther out we go, the less control we have over it, but we can still kind of talk about it if we have that data. So important to kind of look at both of those that are going to be kind of short and long-term in nature. This often, something we hear from nonprofits that, well, I don't have tangible data to point to like that. You can still do surveys about how folks are feeling, right? It's still very powerful for a donor here that, 90% of our clients feel more confident in their ability to X, Y, or Z, right? Or they feel, more connected to their peers, right? Or whatever. Those are all really important things to still be able to communicate that we can get via kind of some surveys or interviews we do with folks, even if they're not necessarily something that's going to be like, a score on a test or a number that we can easily put together. And then finally, a lot of times we're thinking about data on an annual basis, but it's really important to think about data collectively overall. And when we hit milestones, right? So it's it's impressive to say we serve X number a year, but maybe even more meaningful to say, since our beginning, we've served 5,000 people, right? We just had our 1,000th client. Being able to share things like that impact data like that is going to be really important to help people understand that while a lot happens each year, this is generational work and understand that longer term impact we're having in the community. I know we're running out of time, so these are just a couple quick next steps for folks. So I'll leave you with those, but I'll pause here for any questions people have before we wrap up today. And you just type your question in the question box there, and I'll be able to see that. I know someone had their hand raised, so if you just type in the question box, happy to answer those questions. Someone asked, how much of this would I prioritize at one time, like everything we just talked about? Yeah, so I would say it's really important. We have it here on this last slide that you're thinking about these buckets of data and just a couple things for each, improving upon or doing new, right? We all have limited capacity, limited staff. So what's easy to go wrong with data collection is that, okay, I'm going to track everything we just talked about and more. I'm so excited by it. Then inevitably we run out of time. A couple weeks later, right, it's like a New Year's resolution. Then we feel bad about it, then we don't track it anymore. So thinking about just what are those kind of 1 to 3 important things in each of these categories I could start tracking more is definitely where I would start. Someone was asking what tech tools can help you track this data. So for the communication data, a lot of it gets tracked by social media platforms or email managing clients. So I would look at that when you're thinking about both, especially on the email side, platforms to invest in. If you do have something like a Hootsuite or other kind of social media managing software, those can be really helpful too to pull aggregate stats from across the platforms you're posting on, which is going to save you a little bit of time. For the fundraising data, it totally depends on your CRM and donor database, but that's a big thing I would look at if you were choosing a new donor database or CRM, is how many of those stats we were talking about can it automatically pull itself without you having to do the calculation of. So that's going to obviously save you a lot of time there as well. Someone's asking, is there any third-party software you use to visualize this data? I use Salesforce and Excel, but always looking for better tools. That's a great question. We actually have a separate data visualization webinar that you can find on our Learning Commons portal that dives in to that a little bit more. The tech is always kind of changing there, but we often say the easiest thing and the cheapest thing for most people is to take that data they have in Excel, and then if you go on Canva, there's quite a many templates for some basic data visualization, kind of graphs, charts, just a couple kind of simple ways to kind of show that data in kind of meaningful ways. And that's where we often tell folks to start. As you kind of get used to doing that, then there's some additional software out there, but that's where we would often advise people to take a first look. Someone was saying, thoughts on getting program staff to understand they need to collect the data in the first place. Really great point. So I think it goes back to that first slide about context, right? We need to let especially program staff know why we're collecting data in the first place. If it's communicated internally, the only reason we're getting data is because we want to impress donors with it. That doesn't necessarily compel a program staff member, right, to want to collect it. Hopefully we have a culture of philanthropy, they understand the value of that, right, and they want to help. But really letting them know that, look, we're going to collect this data and we're going to use it internally to strengthen our programs. We're going to use it internally to prioritize kind of staff tasks and goals, right, and strategy for the organization. And we're also going to use it externally to share about how great we're doing, to share in the community, so we can kind of get recognition for that and support, and to also share with our donors. So letting them know it's more than just a marketing tool, right? We're not collecting data just to be able to tell donors and foundations about it. We should be collecting data to make ourselves stronger, more efficient, better, and then also using for those external purposes. Someone was asking, are there donor platforms that you suggest to help nonprofits track data and impact? Yeah, so every platform is going to track it in some way. It really depends on what your goal is, right? What you want to focus on. So if you really want to focus on relational data, right, about engagement, there's some platforms that are going to be better than others. I would say a lot of times it's about getting into a CRM in the first place. So if you are tracking an Excel or a really basic database, making that first jump to a really simple platform like Little Green Light will be helpful to you to kind of start tracking some data. And then as you kind of mature that program, Something that might prove a little too simplistic, so you might be looking at something more like creating kind of a custom Salesforce or other platform that's going to help you kind of dive a little deeper into that donor data. But again, with data, we always think it's incremental progress, right? So where are we now? How can we track a little bit more and understand a bit more? And as we get that under our belt, as we have that capacity, then we can always look to add there. Great. I'm not seeing any other questions. I know we're a few minutes over time, so I appreciate you all sticking with us. We'll send out the slides and recording shortly afterwards. And thank you all for joining.